The talk that I gave in Zurich on Sunday night, which we'll put up soon, dealt with the whole idea of chet being natural. The fact that the Rebbeinu Shem set up the world, created the world in such a way from the beginning that there would be sin, that we would do things wrong, there would be tshuva, and there would be Kappara. We talked about the Zohar and Parshas Toldos, where the Torah says to Rebbeinu Shem, how can you set man up for such failure? It's not possible that human beings are going to be able to keep Kol HaTorah Klur. And Hashem says, don't worry, I've already created tshuva, I've created Kappara. We've built it into the system. We understand that people are going to sin, and that's just part of life. That's how it is, and that's what that talk was about. And as I said, we'll circulate it and get it up because it was important. What we see today is that not all sin is natural. There are different categories of sin. There are different categories of Avera. Some are natural and some are not natural. It's always wrong. Avera is always wrong. And the fact that it's natural doesn't mean that it's right. The chiddush is, the idea is that even doing wrong can be natural. That doesn't make it right. We're still punished for the wrong that we do, as natural as it is. And we'll use this in understanding a posuk in Vayikra, which we'll learn together. We'll use a Meshech Chochmah to understand the posuk, and based on the Meshech Chochmah, we'll understand a machlokes, a difference between our Tosfos, who's Rabbeinu Baruch from the French school. Rabbeinu Baruch was one of the great Talmudim of Ri Hazaken, of the Ri, and the Tosfos on Zevachim are generally from Rabbeinu Baruch, and from the Rivo, who we had yesterday and we have again today, brought in the Shita Mukubetzes, who's the founder of the German school, of the school of Ashkenaz, of Tosfos. So the sin is natural. Dמים שנכנסו לכפר בהיכל פסולין, זבחים דף פי א' עמוד בייז. The posuk in the Torah is in Vayikra, פרק ו' חוף ג' וכל חטאת אשר יובא מדמה אל אוהל מועד לכפר בקודש. Any sin offering, or offering, depending how we learn the posuk, whose blood is brought into the oil moed, into the heichal. So that's not the outer area, not the Azara where the big Mizbeach is, but into the Heichal where the Mizbeach HaZahav is, where the golden Mizbeach is. If the blood is brought into there for purposes of atonement, lo te'achel, that meat cannot be eaten, not by the Kohanim, not by anybody else. Bo'ish tisoref, the entire korban has to be consumed in fire, as with an oilo, although it's not an oilo, even if it's a chatos. If it's a chatos that is brought inside the Heichal, then its meat cannot be consumed at all. That's the posuk that we have. Explains the Rashbam, which are the chataos, which are the offerings that are brought on the inside. Par Kohen HaMashiach, par Herem Dovish Tzibur, if the Kohen Gadol does something wrong, if the Sanhedrin does something wrong, par Usir Shel Yom HaKippurim, the Yom Kippur korbanos go on the inside, Useire Avodah Zorah. If a person committed Avodah Zorah, then the seir that has to be brought for that is brought inside. Kol hei elu, all of these 5 korbanot, katuv bahem matanot lifnim behichal, ala parochet mizbeach hazahav. All of these 5 korbanot, it specifically says, are brought inside the Beis HaMikdash, inside the heichal, and their blood is sprinkled either on the curtain, on the parochet that separates the ulam from the Kodesh HaKodashim, or on the mizbeach hazahav, on the incense altar, which is the mizbeach hazahav. Why the differences between these korbanot? Why are certain korbanot is the blood thrown at the outer mizbeach, and some korbanot the blood is thrown on the inner mizbeach? Here we have the Meshech Chochmah, which is foundational, an amazing Meshech Chochmah. Rabbi Simcha of Dvinsk lived in Dvinsk. It was the Rov of Dvinsk between the 2 world wars, wrote the Or Samach and the Meshech Chochmah. V'ha'inyan, the nefesh ha'adam makbil l'mishkan ha'kavod. The human soul is parallel to the Mishkan, to the Beis HaMikdash. It develops this idea in the beginning of Acharei Mos. The kochot hasechel hema makbilim neged mishkan kvod Hashem hasocheach ala kruvim. The powers, the energy of the mind, intellectual dimensions of the human soul, are parallel to the Oren, to the inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where the Oren is. And therefore, kol hachataot asher ba'im al davar shezodono karet asher hu avon hashakul litol nefesh ha'adam ulachrita michelek hachayim, all those sins, the result of which could chas v'sholem be being cut off, one's soul being cut off from its source. Imhu b'shogeg, if you did one of those averos b'shogeg, that means asher hu pu'ulat hachomer. It's through your human instinct caused the Avera. You had a Yetzer Hara, you did something that was wrong. It wasn't that you chose to rebel against God. It's your nature. Lo hit'ah b'seichel, it was not an intellectual error. Makom kapparato b'mizbeach hachitzon. That's important to remember. Those averos that are what I call natural, wrong but natural. An aver with the b'shogeg, you did it just by mistake. The place of Kappara is in the outer area of the Beis Hamikdash, where the outer Mizbeach is, the outer altar is, Asher hu makbil neged halev v'haruach, which is parallel to the heart and to the emotions of the human being and the spirit of the human being. Lo bipnimiyut, that's not the pnimius of the person. So we often consider the emotions and the spirit of the person to be pnimius, to be the inner part of the person. Yes, compared to the hands and legs, it's an inner part. But compared to the mind, it's not the inner part. The mind is more inner, is more interior than the emotions are. If the avera is driven by emotion and instinct, the place of Kappara is outside the heichal. If the emotions are driven by mind and intellect, the place of Kappara is inside the heichal. Therefore, if this is a deliberate intellectual mistake that someone's made, not a mistake, it's zadon, deliberate, where the mistake is an intellectual error, then the Kappara has to be in the inner area of the Mishkan. And there he goes on to include all those korbanot which the Rashbam listed. And those are all korbanot that are made by Beis Din or by the Kohen HaMashiach. People who should know better. They're not just an act of Yetzer Hara. They're an act of miscalculation. Somebody thought it out incorrectly. It's an intellectual error. Furthermore, he says, Ki koach hata'avani asher ba'adan imki bichlalo hu avera. When one does an avera through the power of instinct, even though it is an avera, eino ra'ui lahasiro legamri. This is the idea that I developed on Sunday night, and one of the people there found it so difficult, and he said to me after that, it's also logic, I can't argue with it, but I've never seen anything like it. Where does such a thing come from? I need to see it in writing. You know, some people need to see it in writing. Doesn't matter who wrote it. It could be a cheder child wrote it and put it on the internet, and then it's okay. But if he hasn't seen it in writing, he said, I can't relate to it because I haven't seen it in writing. Good to hear it's in writing in the Meshech Chochmah. Rebbeinu Shalom help me the next day to find where it's written in writing. The Meshech Chochmah says the Yetzer Hara, not only you've done wrong through this instinctual force of emotion and instinct, eino ra'ui lahasiro legamri. You shouldn't even remove the avera completely. It has a place in your life. And I explained on Sunday night also the idea of Kappara comes from kaporet. Kappara is covering the sin. It doesn't erase the sin. It just covers it. It's still there. Why is it still there? Because the Moshe wants it to be there. It has a role to play in your life. It's not something to be completely eradicated. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin, when it comes to Yetzer Hara or your child or your wife, never be brutal. Always be gentle. With one hand, if you have to be disciplining in one hand, if you have to be firm with one hand, make sure that with the other hand you're bringing the person close. And included in that is not only a child and one's wife, but also Yetzer. The Yetzer Hara as well is treated the same way. Treat it gently. Don't treat your Yetzer Hara brutally. It has a part to play. This is part of knowing Hashem with all of yourself. You need your Yetzer Hara also to know Hashem. You need your whole being to know Hashem. There's some beautiful Tel Zerov on that idea, how one has to use the entire being in one's avodas Hashem, even the Yetzer Hara. Afilu lidvar avero. וזה עצם השלימות לזכך את כוחות החומר אשר בד יחלו רק לשם שמיים לקיים המציאות. And that's the essence of avodah, is to take things which are natural, instinctual, emotional, and use them for avodah, not annihilate them, not deny them, not subjugate them, but to use them, to direct them and channel them for avodah. As the Chazal say, there's a whole piece in the Mesilas Yesharim on this, that if one brings to a Talmid Chacham, one brings wine and gives him the pleasure of drinking wine and eating good food, that's like bringing a korban. So part of korbanot is the idea of taking the physical world, taking instinct, taking emotional, taking all those things and using them correctly. Lo chen hata'a b'seichel. Not so if you're making an intellectual error. If there's an error of judgment, if you've thought it through and you've come to a wrong conclusion, that has no place in Avodas Hashem. Intellectual error has no place in Avodas Hashem. You ever make an instinctual mistake, you have a Yetzer Hara, you do something wrong, okay, that's normal, it's natural, you do tshuva, there's Kappara, there's a way of dealing with that. The Rebbeinu Shalom understands that, there's place for that. He built the world that way. But to make an intellectual error of judgment, for that there's no excuse. That has to be completely eradicated. Ki hasheker v'hamered nitzav lo yiratzeh. Because lie, deceit, untruth, which is what an intellectual mistake is. If you make a mistake with a Yetzer Hara, it's not sheker. It's just a Yetzer Hara. If you make a mistake with calculation, if you've thought it through, that's sheker. And that has no place in Avodas Hashem. And he says a beautiful thing. And what stimulated my understanding of this is a piece in a poem of Ibn Gvirul. Ibn Gvirul wrote all the 613 mitzvot out in a poem, Sefer HaAzharot. And in the Sefer HaAzharot, in Mitzvat Lo Ta'aseh Kuf Yud Aleph, it says, Lo ye'achel pnimiyut bezadon uvetarmit. You shall not eat that which is brought on the inside with deliberateness and deceitfulness. He says, those words in Ibn Gvirul, Ibn Gvirul was in the 11th century, unbelievably great person, an artist, a literist, a poet, a philosopher, a massive Talmud Chacham, early Rishonim, almost from the period of the Gaonim. And those 5 words, triggered my understanding of this concept. And it could be that that's what the Ibn Gvirul meant, what I've just explained. Now we can understand the Mishnah, where the Mishnah brings a case of blood that has been mixed up. Some of the blood should be brought on the inside, some of the blood should be brought on the outside. 2 different korbanot, the blood got mixed up. And this person goes, the Kohen goes, and he first pours some of the blood on the inside, bifnim, v'chazav v'natan b'chutz, and then he goes and pours it on the outside, so that he's yotzer both ways. The blood is poured on the inside and the outside. Rabbi Akiva paser. Rabbi Akiva says this is no good. Rabbi Akiva omer, kol damim שנכנסו לכפר בהיכל psulin. Once the blood is brought inside, even if it's blood that shouldn't be brought inside, it's possible. It messes up the korban. If you take outside blood and you bring it inside, that destroys the whole korban, says Rabbi Akiva. Asks Tosfos, but why? Because at the end of the day, he has 2 bloods in this container. He has the blood from the inside, the blood from the outside. The blood from the outside, he's going to pour outside. So he comes inside, he pours a bit of blood inside. Then he goes outside and he pours the blood outside. Yes, he took both bloods inside, but his intention was the Kappara would be, for the inner blood would be inside, and the outer blood would be outside. So that's not considered, as the Pasuk says, V'chol hachatat asher yuva midamai l'ol moed lechaper b'kodesh. He didn't bring the outer blood for purpose of atonement, for purpose of Kappara. He's going to do that outside. And this is just like mayim, it's inert, it's not reactive. And we've got this idea in the previous Mishnah. We look at it as if it's inert, as if it's just water. It's not part of the process. Inside the process is the inner blood. Outside the process is the outer blood. So I don't understand why Rabbi Akiva says this apostle, says Tosfos. At the end of the day, there are 2 bloods. His intention is to do Kappara only on the inner blood. The outer blood he's ignoring. Then he goes outside and he pours the outside blood. What's so terrible about that? Says the Rivor in the Shita Mekubetzet, he says he found the Giloin, he found a manuscript where the Rivor says the Kivan di Yarev bedamim apnimiyim ve'inu atu lechaper. But since the outer blood is mixed with the inner blood, and the inner blood is coming lechaper, Asher Yuval Lechaper Karina Bey. This is called Asher Yuval Lechaper. It has been brought for atonement. It's true he's only using the inner blood for atonement, but the outer blood has been brought into the Beis Hamikdash. Says Rabbeinu Baruch, our Tosfos, the Baal HaTruma says, but who cares? The fact is that outer blood was not brought for Kappara, only the inner blood was brought for Kappara. Says the Rivor, no, the outer blood is brought in and there's a process of Kappara going on. So what's so terrible about that? Says the Meshech Chochmah a little bit further on a different subject, but we'll use it to understand the Rivor. Matzanu chatot hanichnasin lahechel lachein chilka haTorah hamakom shechitzonot lo yikansu lahechal. The Rebbeinu Shalom, the Torah separates the place. And how do you separate place? Not with a fence. You separate place by different halachot. This can go in and this can't. Nobody can go into the Kodesh Kodoshim except the Kohen on Yom Kippur. Nobody can go into the Heichal except the Kohanim. Nobody can go into the Azora except Kohanim and Yisraelim who are Tahorim up to a certain point. Those places are separated by who can go into them. That's how you separate a place. When you go into on an aeroplane and you want to go through the paroches to the first class, somebody will tell you, no, it's not for you. That's how you separate a place. It's not for you. You go there. That's how you separate places. And says the Meshechoch Meshechitzonot lo yikansu leichal. The Torah separates the places of the Beis Hamikdash by what can go where. And the blood of the Chitzonis can't go inside, can't go into first class. Legeder sheyehei hamakom chaluk, because if you allow any old person to go into first class, it's always first class. It's not first class anymore. If you let any blood come into the inner chamber, then it loses the specialness for the dam hapnimi. V'lo yit'arvu zeh b'zeh. These places should not be mixed up. So the Meshech Chochmah is learning, and this is how I suggest we understand the Rivo, is that this is not about the blood, whether the blood is inert or reactive. This is about the place. This is about how the dam hachitzo in the outer blood detracts from the exclusiveness of the inner blood. The inner blood is exclusive because it comes to be mechaper for an intellectual error. And that's completely different from an emotional or an instinctive chet. Completely different. And you can't mix them together. You've got to understand their kapparot are different. When you're doing tshuva, you've got to ask yourself, was this just a yetzer hara? Or was this actually a miscalculation? If it was a miscalculation, it's got to go into the pnimius. You've got to correct it in the inner chambers of the Beis Hamikdash and the parallel inner chambers of the mind. That's where the Kappara has to be. The Kappara can't be emotional. The Kappara can't be physical. The Kappara can't be instinctual. The Kappara has to be, the atonement has to be in the mind. And if you allow the dam achitzon to come into that area as well, you miss the whole point of the Kappara that has to take place for the intellectual avera. And that's how we understand this different worldview of Rabbeinu Baruch in our Tosfos, and the Rivo is brought in the Shita Mekubetzes, using the Meshech Chochmah to understand the Posuk in Vayikra.